You ever wonder if we're living in a timeline where the dumbest ideas secretly run the world? A spring that became a toy, a medical device that turned into, well, let's just say it's still a bestseller, and a weapon that was supposed to make people immortal but just made war worse. Turns out, history's biggest game changers weren't exactly planned. The accidental power of gunpowder. In 9th century China, alchemists were chasing immortality. They weren't looking for a world-changing invention. They just wanted to live forever. Instead, they mixed sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter and ended up with gunpowder. Not exactly the fountain of youth, but definitely explosive. By the 10th century, the Chinese military saw the potential. They packed gunpowder into bamboo tubes and invented fire lances, early flamethrowers that turned battles into chaotic infernos. Soon, there were bombs, rockets, and fire arrows. The Song dynasty wasn't playing around. By the 13th century, Mongols had stolen the formula and carried it across the Middle East and Europe. Medieval armies went from swinging swords to blowing through castle walls. Europe took things to another level. By 1326, the first hand cannons appeared in Italy, because apparently swords weren't violent enough. England got its first taste of gunpowder warfare in 1346 at the Battle of Crécy, when early cannons sent French knights straight to the afterlife. The message was clear. Armor was useless, castles were doomed, and if you didn't have gunpowder, you were about to lose a war. In 1494, France rolled out the first true artillery-based army, blasting through Italian city-states with siege cannons. By the 1600s, muskets had replaced bows, and wars were no longer won by the strongest warriors, but by whoever had more gunpowder. The 19th century brought industrialized warfare, with bullets, TNT, and modern explosives replacing clunky old cannons. By 1945, the world had gone from fire lances to nuclear bombs, proving that when humans invent something dangerous, we don't just stop at mildly destructive. And to think, it all started with a bunch of monks trying to live forever. The toilet that revolutionized cities. For most of history, handling human waste was, let's say, a DIY project. If you lived in a medieval city, you either used a chamber pot or squatted over a hole in the ground, and when that pot got full, you tossed it out the window and yelled "Gardyloo" as a warning. Spoiler, no one was safe. By 1596, a man named Sir John Harrington had had enough. He invented the first flushing toilet, which he called the Ajax. It had a water tank and a flushing system, and he even installed one for Queen Elizabeth I. But the idea didn't catch on because, apparently, people preferred the old bucket and throw method. Fast forward to the 1770s, and Scottish watchmaker Alexander Cumming improved the design by adding the S-bend pipe. This prevented toxic sewer gases from creeping back up into homes, a major win for noses everywhere. Then came Thomas Crapper. Yes, that was his real name. In the 1860s, this English plumber perfected the modern flush toilet and made it commercially available. By 1858, London was drowning in filth, literally. The Great Stink turned the Thames into a toxic sludge river, forcing the British government to build a proper sewer system. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the White House didn't even have indoor plumbing until 1825. In 19th century America, outhouses were still the norm, and many cities reeked of open sewage. The result? Epidemics. Cholera and typhoid fever were wiping people out because sanitation was basically non-existent. By the early 20th century, flush toilets became widespread in homes, and city sanitation improved. But in some places, they were still seen as a luxury. In 1940, nearly half of U.S. homes still had outhouses. It wasn't until the post-war boom that indoor plumbing became standard. Today, the modern toilet has saved millions of lives by preventing disease outbreaks. Meanwhile, Japan has taken things to another level with heated seats, bidets, and even music to mask your business. So, next time you flush, remember, you could be yelling "Gardyloo" instead. The potato chip born out of pure spite. In 1853, Chef George Crumb was working at Moon's Lake House, a fancy resort in Saratoga Springs, New York. One day, a particularly annoying customer kept sending back his fried potatoes, complaining they were too thick and soggy. Crumb, irritated beyond belief, decided to mess with him. He sliced the potatoes as thin as possible, fried them until they were crispy and brittle, and drowned them in salt. He expected the customer to be furious. Instead, the guy loved them. Word spread, and soon, Saratoga chips became a hit. The crispy snack became so popular that Crumb eventually opened his own restaurant, where he continued serving his famous chips in baskets on every table. Yet, despite his role in creating an American food staple, he never profited beyond his restaurant's success. While Crumb focused on cooking, others saw the commercial potential and ran with it. By the early 1900s, chips had already started showing up at state fairs, corner stores, and lunch counters. They weren't factory-made yet, just scooped into bags by hand or sold in wax paper cones. But the habit was forming. Salty, portable, and easy to make in bulk, potato chips slid into everyday American life without needing much fanfare. It wasn't a revolution. It was a quiet takeover. Then came Herman Lay in the 1930s. He turned potato chips into a national obsession, selling them door-to-door before launching what would become Frito-Lay. By the 1950s, the potato chip industry was booming. Flavored chips hit the market thanks to Joe Spud Murphy, an Irish businessman who created cheese and onion and salt and vinegar flavors. By the 1980s, companies were selling billions of bags annually. Today, the global potato chip market is worth over $30 billion, all because George Crumb got petty with a customer. If that's not the best revenge, what is? The stimulator that shocked medicine. In the 19th century, doctors had a problem. Women were showing up at clinics with mysterious symptoms: anxiety, mood swings, sleeplessness, and just general irritation with life. Instead of considering that maybe society was treating them terribly, doctors diagnosed them with hysteria. The treatment? Manual stimulation to induce hysterical paroxysm. Yes, this was considered medical therapy. Doctors hated it. It was time-consuming, exhausting, and they were looking for a shortcut. Enter Dr. Joseph Mortimer Granville. In 1883, he invented the first electromechanical stimulator, not for women, but as a muscle massager. However, doctors quickly realized it could do the hysteria treatment a lot faster. Suddenly, a 2-hour medical session became a few minutes of efficiency. By the early 1900s, electromechanical massagers were advertised in medical catalogs and even sold for home use. They were marketed as health devices for relieving tension and headaches because apparently everyone was too embarrassed to say what they were really for. By the 1920s, these became one of the first electrical appliances ever sold, hitting the market before vacuum cleaners and electric irons. Then came a problem: Hollywood. In the 1920s and 1930s, the device started appearing in early adult films. Doctors were horrified. Suddenly, their medical tool had a whole new reputation. By the 1950s, these disappeared from medical catalogs, but it was too late. The secret was out. The real game changer came in 1968, when the first battery-powered cordless stimulator hit the market. By the 1970s, it was openly sold as a sex product. No more pretending it was for headaches. By 1999, it was inducted into the Smithsonian Museum, officially recognized as one of the most important inventions in medical history. A device meant to cure hysteria ended up revolutionizing sexual health, feminism, and personal wellness. And to think, it all started because doctors got tired of using their hands. The frisbee that started as a pie tin. In the 1940s, college students in New England had an unusual hobby: tossing empty pie tins from the Frisbee Pie Company around for fun. Apparently, after eating a pie, the next logical step was to turn the tin into an airborne sport. When the tins were flying through the air, students would yell "Frisbee" as a warning. This casual campus game turned into an underground phenomenon. Then, in 1948, a guy named Walter Morrison saw a business opportunity. He designed a plastic flying disc, originally calling it the Pluto Platter, to cash in on the UFO craze. Because nothing sells like aliens. By 1957, Morrison sold the design to Wham-O, a toy company known for making weird things profitable. They renamed it Frisbee after learning about the whole pie tin thing. The new name stuck, even though the Frisbee Pie Company had no involvement and got exactly $0 from it. The Frisbee exploded in popularity. By the 1960s, college students turned it into an actual sport. In 1968, a group of New Jersey teenagers invented Ultimate Frisbee, a game that combined football, soccer, and a disc that cost $2.99. By the 1970s, Frisbee golf, disc golf, was born, and suddenly, the world had yet another way to justify day drinking outdoors. The US military even experimented with using frisbees as weaponized throwing devices. It didn't work, but props for trying. Meanwhile, NASA astronauts took frisbees to space because, apparently, even trained professionals get bored in zero gravity. To date, over 300 million frisbees have been sold, proving that people really love throwing things. All because some college students couldn't let a pie tin go to waste. The superglue that was too sticky. In 1942, Dr. Harry Coover, a chemist working for Eastman Kodak, was trying to develop clear plastic gun sights for World War II. Instead, he accidentally created cyanoacrylate, a substance so sticky it bonded to everything instantly. Problem? It was too strong. Every test resulted in materials getting permanently glued together. Frustrated, Coover ditched the formula. 6 years later, in 1949, Coover's team rediscovered the compound while working on aircraft canopies. This time, they realized the insane bonding power could actually be useful, just not for planes. By 1958, superglue hit the market, sold as Eastman No. 910. The product worked too well. It bonded skin instantly, leading to thousands of accidental finger fusion incidents. But it also caught the attention of the U.S. military. During the Vietnam War, battlefield medics used superglue to seal open wounds in seconds. It saved countless lives by stopping bleeding long enough for soldiers to reach proper medical care. The FDA eventually banned its use for humans due to toxicity concerns, but it laid the groundwork for medical adhesives used in surgery today. Then came the weird applications. Superglue has been used to lift fingerprints in crime investigations, repair coral reefs, and even help weightlifters with torn calluses. In 1980, Coover himself received the National Medal of Technology for an invention he originally considered a failure. Today, over 50,000 tons of superglue are sold every year. Not bad for something that was discarded twice before anyone realized it could literally hold the world together. The duct tape that started as a war fix. In 1942, the U.S. military had a problem. Soldiers' ammo boxes were sealed with wax-coated paper and string, which took too long to open under fire. This wasn't just inconvenient, it was a life-or-death issue. Enter Vesta Stout, a factory worker and mother of 2 Navy sailors. She wrote to President Franklin D. Roosevelt with a solution: a waterproof, cloth-backed adhesive tape that could be torn by hand and used to seal anything. Roosevelt passed her idea to Johnson & Johnson, which developed what we now call duct tape. Initially, it was army green and used for sealing equipment, patching tents, and even fixing guns. Soldiers realized it could hold everything together, including jeeps, boots, and even airplane wings. It worked so well that post-war America refused to let it go. By the 1950s, duct tape got a silver makeover to match heating ducts, giving it its modern name. But it didn't stop there. It became the go-to emergency fix for everything. NASA astronauts used it to repair the Apollo 13 lunar module in 1970, possibly preventing one of the biggest space disasters in history. Since then, duct tape has been used to fix racing cars, patch leaks on submarines, and even build entire boats. In 2003, a Texas man even made a working bridge out of it. Every year, over 1 billion feet of duct tape are sold. What started as a battlefield fix is now every DIYer's best friend. If something breaks, you can ignore it, or slap some duct tape on it and pretend you're an astronaut. The slinky that fell into history. In 1943, naval engineer Richard James was working in a Philadelphia shipyard, trying to develop a system that would stabilize sensitive naval instruments aboard warships. His focus? Tension springs that could absorb shock and keep equipment steady during rough seas. But then, one spring slipped off a shelf. Instead of crashing to the ground, it flipped, stretched, and gracefully walked down a stack of books. Most people would have laughed and moved on. James saw a business opportunity. For the next 2 years, he worked to perfect the design. He settled on 80 feet of tightly coiled steel, which allowed the slinky to move fluidly, step by step. His wife, Betty James, came up with the name, a word that means sleek and graceful, and in 1945, they launched it at Gimbel's department store in Philadelphia. The first 400 units sold out in 90 minutes. By the 1950s, the slinky was a full-blown phenomenon. It had one job: walking downstairs, no lights, no batteries, no complicated mechanics, just pure physics in motion. Yet, despite its simplicity, it became a household staple. Over 300 million have been sold worldwide. But the slinky didn't just stay a toy. NASA used it in zero-gravity experiments aboard space missions to demonstrate the behavior of springs in weightlessness. The U.S. military repurposed its flexible coils for radio antennas in Vietnam. Engineers used it to study wave mechanics and seismic activity. Somehow, a spring meant for naval ships ended up everywhere. Then came the business disaster. Richard James had a midlife crisis, joined a religious cult, and abandoned his company. Betty James saved the business from collapse, lowered the price, and made sure the slinky became a timeless American classic. Today, the slinky is still selling, still confusing scientists, and still proving that entertainment doesn't need an app or a screen. all because a clumsy engineer dropped something in the right way. The bubble wrap that almost became wallpaper. In 1957, engineers Alfred Fielding and Mark Chavans had a revolutionary idea: textured wallpaper. They sealed two sheets of plastic together with air bubbles inside, thinking people would love a futuristic padded look for their walls. Spoiler, no one did. Turns out, nobody wanted their house to look like a giant air mattress. By 1959, Fielding and Chavans were stuck with a useless product until IBM launched the 1401 computer. Computers were fragile, and shipping them was a nightmare. The inventors had an idea. What if their weird plastic wallpaper could protect expensive electronics? IBM started using it, and suddenly, bubble wrap had a real purpose. From there, Sealed Air Corporation was born, and by the 1960s, bubble wrap was everywhere, protecting everything from glassware to medical equipment. By the 1980s, it was a $3 billion industry. It even made its way into NASA equipment, protecting instruments sent to space. But let's be honest, most people don't care about its shipping benefits. The real appeal? Popping it. Scientists have actually studied why it's so satisfying. A 2012 study found that popping bubble wrap reduces stress and increases dopamine. Offices started keeping sheets of it around for employees, and in 2001, the first Bubble Wrap Appreciation Day was declared. Then came the tragedy of 2015. Sealed Air tried to introduce unpoppable bubble wrap called iBubble Wrap. The internet lost its mind. People were furious. The backlash was so bad that regular bubble wrap remains untouched. Today, over 240,000 miles of bubble wrap are produced each year, enough to wrap around the Earth 10 times. So, what started as a terrible interior design idea ended up protecting the world's technology and keeping millions of people entertained. The ATM that no one trusted. In 1967, London's Barclays Bank unveiled the first ever ATM, automated teller machine. The idea came from John Shepherd Barron, a Scottish inventor who was frustrated that banks closed early. His solution? A machine that spit out cash 24/7. No humans required. The first ATM used paper vouchers with radioactive ink to verify withdrawals. Yes, radioactive. The system worked, but customers weren't exactly thrilled about handling glow-in-the-dark money. By the 1970s, banks in the US and Europe began installing ATMs with plastic cards and PIN codes. The concept was revolutionary, but people didn't trust it. Many still preferred waiting in long lines rather than trusting a robot with their life savings. That changed in 1980, when Citibank spent $100 million installing ATMs all over New York. Then came the blizzard of 1980. Banks shut down, but ATMs kept working. Customers, now desperate for cash, flooded the machines. ATM usage skyrocketed overnight. By the 1990s, ATMs were everywhere, spitting out cash in airports, gas stations, and even fast food restaurants. Some machines even dispensed gold bars, pizzas, and live bait. Today, there are over 3.5 million ATMs worldwide, handling $14 trillion in transactions every year. But with digital banking taking over, the ATM's future is uncertain. Still, for decades, it let people skip bank lines and withdraw cash at 2 a.m. in questionable neighborhoods. Progress? Absolutely. The rubber duck that became a scientific tool. Rubber ducks have one job: floating in bathtubs and making kids laugh. But in 1992, they accidentally became one of the most important tools in oceanography. It all started when a shipping container fell off a cargo ship in the Pacific Ocean. Inside, 28,800 rubber ducks and other bath toys. The container cracked open, and thousands of ducks, turtles, and beavers spilled into the sea, drifting off in every direction. Most people would assume they'd just sink or wash up on a beach. But oceanographers realized they had a golden opportunity. A scientist named Curtis Ebbesmeyer, an expert in ocean currents, saw the floating ducks as perfect trackers for studying how water moves across the globe. Over the next several years, the ducks traveled thousands of miles. Some froze in Arctic ice and reappeared in the Atlantic. Others washed up in Hawaii, Australia, and even Scotland. By 2003, ducks had made it to the UK and New England, proving how interconnected the world's oceans are. The findings helped refine scientific models for ocean currents and even improved our understanding of how plastic pollution spreads. Researchers estimated that only 2,000 of the original 28,800 ducks have ever been found, meaning most are still out there, drifting in the ocean. Today, rubber ducks aren't just bath toys. They've become symbols of environmental research and are even sold as collectibles, with ocean-weathered ducks fetching hundreds of dollars at auctions. So, the next time you see a rubber duck, remember, it might be a lost scientific instrument from 1992, still doing its job. Today we're going to be talking about things that you didn't know were made by the Chinese. Paper money. While the rest of the world was too immersed in the sound of clinking coins to symbolize wealth, China was already going band for band. Scratch that, they were going M for M with papers. When the people from Tang Dynasty decided they'd had enough of the jingling workout every time they went to buy something, they came up with this totally new way to buy stuff that didn't involve hauling around bags of bronze or iron. They basically said, screw it, let's make paper cash. By the 7th century, trade was popping off in China. People were moving goods up and down the Silk Road, bringing all kinds of in and out of the empire. The problem? Coins weighed a freaking ton, especially if you were trying to buy anything more expensive than a noodle bowl. So the government started issuing these little notes as a receipt, letting people drop off their heavy cash at local offices and just carry around paper instead. This idea blew up so hard that by the time the Song Dynasty rolled around a couple of centuries later, they made it official and turned paper money into legal currency. But paper money wasn't anything fancy. This was before wallets, banks, or credit cards. They just wrote a few numbers on a piece of paper and called it a day. It was more like an IOU from the government than the dollar bills we've got now, but still, it worked. People trusted these notes because, well, what were their options? CrossFit? The emperor said it was money, so it was money. Imagine if the government just handed you a piece of paper today and told you it was worth $100. Wait, they do that now. Dang it. The Chinese government controlled the whole process because if paper was money back then, every Jackie Chan would just be making one at home. Only specific shops, usually approved by the government, could give out this paper money. So, if you tried to hand over some DIY currency, you'd probably be thrown into jail. It took until Marco Polo's trip to China in the 13th century for anyone in the West to even hear about this stuff. Marco was like, "You guys are not going to believe this." He saw how everyone in China was all about their paper cash and basically went home to Europe screaming about it. Took Europe a few hundred more years to catch up, though. Typical. The funny part is, the Chinese eventually got tired of their own invention. By the time the Ming Dynasty came around, inflation hit hard. Basically, the government printed so much paper money that it became worthless. You could have a sack full of notes, and it wouldn't even buy you a single dumpling. So they had to ditch the whole idea for a while and go back to metal coins. Toilet paper. Scrubby people. This was also invented by the Chinese. In the 6th century, during the Sui Dynasty in China, people began using paper for ass wiping after using the toilet. Before this, many of them cleaned with, things. Yeah, things. These things. Paper was a revolutionary product for them since it was invented almost 1,000 years ago before this. At first, it was mainly used for writing important documents or wrapping valuable items. As time passed, paper became more available and affordable. People started to find new uses for it. In the 6th century, a scholar named Yan Zhitui wrote about using paper for toilet purposes. He mentioned that he wouldn't use paper that had writing on it to clean himself, showing that people were indeed using plain paper to wipe after doing their business. And then the 8th century came, and there was this Arab dude called Abi Zaid al-Sirafi. He saw that the Chinese were wiping and wrote in his blog, "Guys, what's up? Day 30 of my world tour. Currently in China. They don't use bidets over here. They have toilet papers. Pretty disgusting if you ask me. Smearing it all over your ass and calling it clean." As the centuries went on, the production of toilet paper in China increased. In the 14th century, during the Ming Dynasty, there are records of large-scale production. In 1393, it was recorded that the imperial court in Nanjing ordered 720,000 sheets of toilet paper for the use of the imperial family and the palace. These sheets were quite large, measuring about 2 feet by 3 feet. In addition, 15,000 sheets of special soft perfumed toilet paper were made specifically for the emperor's use. This shows that toilet paper was not only widely used, but also had variations in quality. While the Chinese were advancing in their use of toilet paper, people in other parts of the world were still using other methods. In medieval Europe, for example, people often used hay, straw, moss, or even their own hands to clean themselves after using the toilet. The idea of using paper for toilet purposes began to spread slowly beyond China. In the 16th century, the invention of the printing press made paper more common in Europe. However, paper was still relatively expensive, and people were not quick to use it for cleaning themselves. It took several more centuries before toilet paper became a product available in the Western world. Kites. In ancient China, kites were important tools used for many things. People used them for big tasks, like in wars and solving hard problems. Can you believe they used kites to plan battles or measure how wide a river is? It's like using a paper airplane to do your math homework. Well, maybe not exactly, but you get the idea. Kites were a big part of life back then, and they did much more than just look pretty in the sky. Back then, armies didn't have the gadgets we have today. No phones, radios, or walk-the-talk phones. Oh, it's apparently called walkie-talkie, but whatever. They needed a way to talk over long distances on the battlefield, so they used kites. They made kites with different shapes, colors, and designs. Each one meant something special. A red kite might mean, attack now, and a blue one could mean, stay where you are. A kite with a dragon design might signal, enemy ahead. It was like sending a message, but in the sky. Soldiers had to watch the skies to see what the kites were telling them. Soldiers had to learn what each kite meant, or else, things would go south. Measuring things was also hard without tools. If an army came to a big river, they needed to know how wide it was. They couldn't just swim across to check, and they didn't have bridges ready. So they flew a kite over the river to the other side. The kite string went from one bank to the other. Then they pulled back the kite and measured the string. Now they knew how wide the river was. Pretty exhausting though, but it worked. Hansen used a kite in a clever way. He wanted to attack a city, but the walls were too strong to break, so he decided to dig a tunnel under the walls. But he needed to know how long to make the tunnel. If the tunnel was too short, they wouldn't reach inside the city. If it was too long, they would waste time and energy. He flew a kite over the walls, and the string showed him the distance. His soldiers dug the tunnel just right, and they took over the city. Kites were also used to scare the enemy. Soldiers made kites that looked like scary creatures, like dragons or ghosts. At night, they flew these kites over the enemy camp. The wind made spooky sounds as it went through the kites. The enemy heard the noises and saw strange shapes in the sky. They got scared, thinking ghosts or spirits were coming for them. Toothbrush. Well, at least the bristled ones. Not that I know any other kinds of toothbrush. In the Tang dynasty of China, people made a new tool for cleaning teeth called the bristle toothbrush. They used stiff hairs from the necks of hogs. Using pig hairs to brush teeth was normal then. They needed a way to keep their teeth clean, and this was how they did it. They made handles from bone or bamboo. The handle was cut to the right size to fit in the hand. At one end, they made tiny holes. They put the hog bristles into these holes. They had to make sure the bristles didn't fall out. It was like making a little brush by hand. Getting the hog bristles wasn't easy. Pigs don't just give away their hairs. People had to collect the stiff hairs from the pigs' necks. Maybe they had to sneak up on the pigs. It must have been a tough job, and probably not the best smelling one. The hog bristles were stiff and sharp. They could scrub the teeth and remove food bits. But they might have hurt the gums. People back then might have thought, if it doesn't hurt, it's not working. They didn't have soft toothbrushes like we do now. Before the bristle toothbrush, people used other things to clean their teeth. They chewed on sticks or used cloth. The bristle toothbrush was better. It could reach between teeth. It was like getting an upgrade. It was the new gadget of their time. Making the toothbrush took time and effort. They didn't have factories or machines. Everything was made by hand. They had to find the right materials and put it all together. It wasn't easy, but they did it. They were resourceful with what they had. You might think that hog bristles now would be something people in the Sentinelese Island would use, but the Tangs didn't have plastic or nylon. They used what they had. You can also use what you have to click the subscribe button. Nobody will blame you for it. Mechanical clock. During the Song dynasty, there was a man named Su Song. He was born in 1020 and lived until 1101. He was very smart and knew a lot about many things. In 1092, he built a big clock tower in the city of Kaifeng. This clock tower was special because it was powered by water and was about 12 meters high. The clock tower showed how the sun, moon, and stars moved. On top of the tower, there was a model of the sky called an armillary sphere. It had rings that showed how the sun and stars moved across the sky. There was also a globe that showed where the stars were. People could look at the tower and see where the stars were at any time. The clock tower worked by using water. Water flowed down and turned a big wheel. This wheel made other wheels and gears inside the clock move. This was one of the first mechanical clocks ever made. Before this, people used sundials or simple water clocks that were not very good at keeping time. Susong's big clock was much better. I would have loved to see this big clock of his, or maybe I'm just zesty. Inside his massive clock, there was a special part called an escapement. This helped the clock keep time by controlling how the gears moved. It made sure the clock didn't run too fast or too slow. Susong was one of the first people to use an escapement in a clock. This was important because it made clocks more accurate. Without it, the clock would be useless. Another cool thing about the clock was that it used a chain drive. The chain helped move things inside the clock. This was before anyone else used chains and machines. The chain drive helped the clock work smoothly. Su Song wrote a book about his clock tower. It was called New Design for an Armillary Sphere and a Celestial Globe. In the book, he drew pictures of the clock and explained how it worked. He wanted to share his ideas so others could learn. Maybe he hoped other people would build their own clock towers. In 1127, the city was attacked by enemies called the Jurchen. They came from the north and wanted to take over. They ransacked the town, and with it came the fall of his erected clock. Card games. During the Tang Dynasty from 618 to 907 AD, China was a land of innovation and cultural growth. Paper, which had been invented earlier, became more widely used, not just for writing but also for new forms of entertainment. People were getting tired of the same old games, so they started looking for something fresh. This is when playing cards came into the picture. The earliest known reference to playing cards comes from the 9th century. A writer named Su A mentioned in his book, Collection of Miscellanea at Duyang, that Emperor Yizong of Tang's daughter, Princess Tongchang, played a leaf game in 868 AD. These leaf games were the first playing cards. They were thin pieces of paper, small enough to hold in one hand. People began using them for games that were different from traditional board games. At first, the cards were simple. They had numbers and basic symbols on them. The games played with these cards were straightforward, but they offered a new kind of fun that people hadn't experienced before. Families and friends would gather to play, enjoying this new pastime that was easy to learn and play anywhere. As the popularity of these cards grew, so did their complexity. Artists started to decorate the cards with intricate designs. They drew images of gods, mythical creatures, and scenes from popular stories. This made the cards more interesting to look at and added a new layer to the games. The artwork on the cards became a form of expression, showcasing the artist's skills. People began to collect different decks, each with unique designs. Some cards featured characters from famous novels or plays. Others had symbols representing different social classes or professions. The variety in designs made collecting cards a hobby in itself. It wasn't just about playing games anymore. It was also about owning beautiful pieces of art. In addition to being used for games, playing cards became tools for education and storytelling. Some cards had poems or moral lessons written on them. Parents used these cards to teach their children while they played. The cards became a way to pass down knowledge and culture from one generation to the next. But as with many things, some people took it too far. They started gambling more than they could afford, causing trouble for themselves and their families. Some people got so obsessed with the games that they lost their homes and belongings. It was a damn shame to see lives ruined over a deck of cards. The government noticed these problems and tried to step in. Laws were made to regulate gambling and prevent people from losing everything. Officials warned about the dangers of excessive gambling, but not everyone listened. Despite the risks, card games remained popular because they were just too much fun to give up. During festivals and public celebrations, card games became a common sight. People would gather in public places to play, sometimes forming large groups. The games added to the festive atmosphere and provided entertainment for both players and onlookers. As the Tang Dynasty came to an end, the use of playing cards continued to flourish. The following Song Dynasty, which lasted from 960 to 1279 AD, saw even more developments. The invention of woodblock printing made it possible to produce cards more efficiently. This meant that more people could afford them, and the games became even more widespread. Parachute. The idea of the parachute was touched upon by Chinese inventors long before it became known elsewhere. In ancient China, people experimented with devices to slow down falls. They used materials like bamboo and silk to create structures that could catch the air. During the Han Dynasty, there were records of acrobats performing stunts using umbrellas or similar contraptions. They would jump from high places, using these devices to ease their fall. It showed they knew a thing or two about air resistance. They observed that spreading out surfaces could slow down movement through the air. In the centuries that followed, inventors kept tinkering with designs. They looked at how birds spread their wings and how leaves floated to the ground. Using this knowledge, they made improvements to their own gear. By the time of the Ming Dynasty, more advanced concepts emerged. People started using large, cloth-like materials to create parachute-like devices. These weren't perfect, but they were a heck of a step forward. They tested these devices by jumping from trees or platforms. It was risky, but they were determined to find ways to make it work. Chinese inventors also explored the use of kites, like I said earlier. They noticed that kites could stay in the air due to wind and design. This led them to think about how similar principles could apply to slowing a fall. They experimented with different shapes and sizes, adjusting their designs based on what did or didn't work. They weren't afraid to fail and try again. There are tales of a man named Wan Hu, who supposedly tried to reach the stars using rockets and a chair. Materials played a big role in these developments. Silk, being strong and lightweight, was an ideal choice. It allowed for large surfaces that could catch the air without adding too much weight. Bamboo provided sturdy frames. The combination of these materials made their experiments more successful. They made do with what they had and made it work. The understanding of air resistance and gravity wasn't formalized yet, but they had practical knowledge. They knew that wider surfaces fell slower. This common-sense approach guided their designs. Acupuncture. You know, that process where you have to look like this guy and a pufferfish combined to be relaxed. Chinese thing, really. People began using acupuncture over 2,500 years ago. They believed it could treat various illnesses and restore health. In the early days, during the Stone Age, people used sharp stones and bones for treatment. These were called beyond stones. They used them to pierce the skin and drain abscesses. This was a basic form of acupuncture. As time went on, they started using metal needles made of bronze and iron. This allowed for more precise treatments. Ancient Chinese medicine is based on the concept of qi. Qi is the vital life force that flows through the body. It moves along pathways called meridians. There are 12 main meridians, each linked to an organ system. If qi flows smoothly, a person stays healthy. If the flow is blocked or unbalanced, sickness can occur. Acupuncture aims to restore the balance of qi by unblocking the meridians. Around 100 BC, a medical text called the Huangdi Neijing, or the Yellow Emperor's Inner Canon, was compiled. This text lays out the theories behind Chinese medicine. It describes the meridians, acupoints, and methods of diagnosis and treatment. The book has two parts, the Su Wen and the Ling Shu. The Ling Shu focuses on acupuncture and details the techniques and functions of acupuncture points. During the Han Dynasty, acupuncture became more organized. Doctors began to classify diseases and their treatments. They also started using pulse diagnosis to determine the state of qi in the body. In the following centuries, acupuncture continued to develop. In the Tang Dynasty, the government established medical schools. They trained doctors in acupuncture and herbal medicine. Bronze acupuncture statues were created during this time. These statues had holes at the acupoints and were used for teaching. Students would practice needling the points. If they hit the right spot, water inside the statue would leak out. When Western medicine began to influence China, some scholars viewed traditional medicine as outdated. In 1822, the Qing government removed acupuncture from the Imperial Medical Institute. They considered it unfit for the elite. Practitioners were pushed to the margins, but acupuncture persisted among the common people. Rural communities continued to rely on traditional medicine. But then again, we still have it today. Seismograph. In 132 AD, Zhang Heng, a Chinese scientist and inventor, created the first seismograph to detect earthquakes. Earthquakes were a big problem in China, causing damage and loss of life. People had no way to know when or where they would happen, especially if they occurred far away. Zhang Heng wanted to find a way to detect these earthquakes so help could be sent quickly to affected areas. Zhang Heng was skilled in many fields like astronomy, mathematics, and engineering. He thought hard about how to make a device that could sense the direction of an earthquake. He designed a large bronze vessel shaped like a barrel. Around its outside, he placed 8 dragons, each facing a different direction: north, northeast, east, southeast, south, southwest, west, and northwest. Each dragon held a bronze ball in its mouth. Below each dragon was a bronze toad with its mouth open, ready to catch the ball. Inside the vessel, Zhang Heng set up a pendulum and a system of levers. When the ground shook from an earthquake, even one far away, the pendulum would move. This movement would trigger the mechanism, causing the dragon facing the direction of the earthquake to drop its ball into the toad's mouth below. When a ball dropped, it made a loud sound, alerting people that an earthquake had occurred. The direction of the dragon that dropped the ball showed where the earthquake came from. This was a clever way to know not just that an earthquake happened, but also where it was located. One day, the seismograph released a ball from the dragon facing west. People in the city didn't feel any shaking and thought the device was broken. Some probably muttered, "This contraption is busted," but Zhang Heng trusted his invention. A few days later, messengers arrived from the west, reporting that an earthquake had indeed struck in that direction. This proved that the seismograph worked and could detect earthquakes that people couldn't feel. Zhang Heng's seismograph was important because it was the first tool to detect earthquakes and show their direction. It helped officials know when and where earthquakes occurred so they could send help if needed. This was crucial in a time when news traveled slowly by messengers on foot or horseback. Over the years, others built on his idea to make better seismographs. His work laid the foundation for modern seismology, the study of earthquakes. Today, scientists use electronic sensors and computers to detect and record seismic activity. While these modern tools are more advanced, the basic principle remains the same: detecting vibrations from the earth to understand earthquakes. Crossbows. During the Warring States period, around the 5th century BC, Chinese craftsmen created this new type of bow. It was different from regular bows because it had a horizontal limb assembly mounted on a stock. This design allowed a shooter to release bolts with more force than a normal bow. The early crossbows had a simple trigger mechanism. This allowed soldiers to hold the drawn bow without much effort. They could aim more carefully and shoot with greater accuracy. The trigger was a key part of the crossbow's power. Chinese armies began to use crossbows widely. They became a common sight on the battlefield. The crossbow bolts could pierce armor and shields. This made them deadly against enemy troops. The weapon could also shoot over long distances. Soldiers could attack from afar, keeping themselves safer. As time went on, the Chinese improved the crossbow. They developed the repeating crossbow, which could fire multiple bolts quickly. This was achieved by adding a magazine to hold extra bolts. The shooter could operate a lever to draw the string and load a new bolt in one motion. This increased the rate of fire, making the crossbow even more dangerous. The crossbow changed military tactics in China. Armies began to use formations that took advantage of the weapon's power. Crossbowmen could weaken enemy forces before close combat began. They were often placed behind shield walls or on higher ground. This gave them a better position to rain bolts down on their foes. Crossbow technology did not stay in China. It spread to other parts of Asia and eventually to Europe. Other cultures saw the effectiveness of the crossbow and adopted it. In Europe, the crossbow became a key weapon during the Middle Ages. It was used in many battles and sieges. Negatives. These negatives first showed up in a book called The 9 Chapters on the Mathematical Art. This book was put together during the Han Dynasty, around 200 BC to 200 AD. It had many math problems that people used in daily life, like measuring fields and calculating taxes. Chinese mathematicians used counting rods to do calculations. These rods were small sticks made of bamboo or bone. They placed them on a counting board to represent numbers. Red rods stood for positive numbers, and black rods stood for negative numbers. This system let them work with both positive and negative numbers easily. They needed negative numbers to deal with debts. In trade and business, people often owed money. Debts were like negative amounts, and assets were positive amounts. By using negative numbers, they could show debts in their calculations. This made it possible to solve problems involving money owed and money earned. For example, if someone wanted to buy 7 jars of opium for 1 coin each jar, but only had 5 coins, they would have -2 coins and crippling addiction. Quick maths. Using counting rods, they showed this as 2 black rods, meaning -2. This way, they could keep track of debts and assets accurately. It was a practical method that helped them in everyday transactions. In the 9 chapters, there are problems that involve adding and subtracting positive and negative numbers. They did not see negative numbers as strange. Instead, they used them just like positive numbers. This was different from other places, where people did not accept negative numbers for a long time. They developed rules for working with negative numbers. These rules are still taught today in math classes. In other parts of the world, like Europe, negative numbers were not accepted until much later. European mathematicians thought negative numbers did not make sense. They called them absurd or fictitious. It was not until the 17th century that negative numbers became widely used in Europe. They also used negative numbers in solving equations. For instance, they could set up equations with unknowns and solve them even when the numbers were negative. This allowed them to solve more complex problems than those who did not use negative numbers. So now, here's your random fact because I don't know how to end the video again. The Yangtze River is Asia's longest river. It's also the 3rd longest in the world. See y'all.